Here, I'll start with you. As we've mentioned, you're a war widow. Just tell us what happened.
My husband Gary was a reservist in the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, so we had our own company in Nottingham and we worked together in a small engineering company. And Gary was deployed to Afghanistan on the 22nd of February, and on the 13th of April his vehicle hit an anti-tank mine, killing Gary and his friend and colleague and seriously injuring 2 other people in the vehicle. And we were told later that evening by 2 RAF officers who came to the house to tell us that Gary had been killed.
And the way they told you and the way they broke the news to you, I mean, were you satisfied that it was done in the most, caring possible, supportive environment so that it could be?
I would imagine any news like this is one that you never want to hear. But I have to say that when they came to my house, they were incredibly respectful. They tried to answer as many questions honestly with the information that they had at the time, and I could just see that they were so genuinely sorry as well.
So, Khuna, tell me about the women in Afghanistan. We've just watched your incredible story there. What are some of their stories and experiences?
Widowhood in Afghanistan, for most women, I would say, is like a prison sentence. And it is just their stories are so heartbreaking. I remember going through editing for quite a while, and I've cried so much with them. It is so sad. As a woman, as an Afghan woman, I feel it is just such a waste of life. And once an Afghan woman loses husband, she almost loses status, every freedom. And not only in this film that I've spoken to widows in Afghanistan, I've worked with a lot of women in the past. I've heard so many stories from widows in my relatives, in families, and in Afghanistan on the program that I did. Most of them have used this term of people see as a pot with no lid. And it gives, this one sentence has stayed with me for all my working life. With Afghan women, and it says a lot about when a woman loses husband, what it means. In some cases they lose freedom to laugh, they lose freedom to wear colorful clothes, they lose freedom to celebrate, and also they face serious poverty. A husband is the breadwinner in the family, and when they face this situation, and we see Afghan security forces losing life almost every day. Nowadays in news, I follow it every day, and it brings more sadness to life. And I hope the future will not stay like this.
Jackie, is it really, I mean, how does it affect you or can you comprehend what Zarghuna is saying about, Afghan women who are in the same situation as you?
I can honestly relate to the women who's lost their husbands, and I lost Gary 6 years ago, but I still miss him as much as ever. I still love him as much as ever, and I've been able with my girls to rebuild a life how I would like to rebuild a life. I mean, I've never met anybody else. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking more of rebuilding emotionally and trying to come to terms with losing Gary. And I had no idea, really, that the situation for the Afghani women and maybe other women in there, how horrific. I can't imagine trying to deal with the loss of a husband and then having no right over your life and in some cases over your children, financial situation. I honestly just don't know how they're coping.
Let's get the view from Kabul now, and we're joined by Adela Raz, who's the spokesperson for President Hamid Karzai. Adela, thank you very much for joining us here on Impact. We're just hearing some, horrific stories about what war widows go through in Afghanistan. Just tell us what support networks are available for them there.
Thank you, Yalda Jan, for having me on the show. Well, with no doubt, it is Afghanistan, and there are complications and difficulties as well. But relatively speaking, and comparing Afghanistan with some of the countries, the welfare system here is it's better. It's the government does have specific programs for those military officers who die in the field and on duty. And that includes for police and as well as National Army. And even for those who are not actively on the combat forces, but they're civilians and they die on a suicide attack. So the government does have a program in terms of monetary support, as well as helping their kids in terms of educational facilities. That means schools and of course university and even scholarships. And then on top of that, there is also a program in order to help these families in terms of settlement, and meaning to find them houses if they're eligible, giving them land. So these programs, does exist, and respective ministries are aware. And when such an unfortunate incident happens in terms of a military officer being killed in the field, the respective ministries inform the relative and the entity for it, and then they take the necessary action for that.
I understand and appreciate what you're saying about there being these welfare systems, but you know, we have heard from women in the film who say they simply don't know how to access their husbands' pensions, this welfare, and of course a lack of education, you know, adds to that. So how do you go about assisting the women to become aware of it?
Well, we do know that Afghanistan, the illiteracy rate here is pretty high, and it's more true for women in this country. And when they do come across with such a difficult incident in their life, the first hope is that the family will help them. But more than anything, what happens is that as the ministries themselves, the respective entities themselves report, and then it's the job of the government to make sure that those resources are delivered to the family. But we do agree, some of these families do live in rural area, and some having access to the center, to the headquarters, is quite complicated, and usually it's a lengthy process and it does take time. But eventually the support does reach to them, and the government is doing whatever it's possible to make sure that these families, especially these widows, do have access.
Adela John, we'll just bring in Jackie, because we are running short of time. Jackie, just tell us about what support networks have become available to you as a war widow here.
I was informed within hours of Gary's death. Secondly, within weeks, the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund had sent me financial assistance. The Royal Air Force allocated me a visiting officer. With the visiting officer, they arranged, I'm not sure what the social services, somebody to come and help me fill out forms and tell me what I was entitled to, what I wasn't entitled to. Obviously, unconditional love and support from all my families and friends, and even, you know, from the general public. You know, so much people just, you know, wanted to do so much, and I feel I've been cocooned and been able to cope much better with the loss of Gary. I honestly can't, because when they first told me about Gary, I felt incredibly helpless and absolutely terrified. I had no idea what was going to happen to us. But fortunately for me, within hours, I was reassured that they hadn't forgotten about us, and that so many people cared from us, from the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, from the Royal Air Force itself. Even the MOD have done a covenant now, an armed forces covenant, that helps my children through university. Well, such a huge difference.
We'll have to, unfortunately, leave it there. Thank you very much, Adela John, for joining us from Kabul, Jackie Thompson here in the studio, and Zarhuna Kakar.
Thank you.
Well, of course, you can see more on those stories this weekend on BBC World from the War Widows of Afghanistan. That's all at these times that you can see on your screen on BBC World News.